Hi there, thanks so much for tuning in today. Recently, one of my regular viewers, Tyrese, asked me this question. Would you be inspired by a topic on specifying the voice types, Fach, different problems the type could face, and training tips specific for them? And yes, Tyrese, I am very inspired by this particular topic, so much so that I want to begin a series in which I discuss the various voice types, their characteristics, as well as their unique training challenges. So thank you so much for the suggestion. If you're not familiar with the German Fach system, it's essentially a way of classifying singing voices based on a number of different factors, including vocal range, tessitura, vocal weight, and timbre. And all the voices within these individual classifications and their subclassifications share some common characteristics as well as some common training challenges, which I'll discuss in the upcoming series. So, today I want to begin by discussing the countertenor voice. Now, technically, countertenor is not part of the German Fach system. However, it is a legitimate voice type, as my special guest today can attest to. So today I have with me Ian Howell, who holds a DMA in vocal performance and is on the voice faculty and is the vocal pedagogy director at the New England Conservatory. He's done a lot of research and has published on the topic of the singing voice, and he is a professional countertenor. So I thought, who better to invite into this conversation to share his insights than Ian Howell? So I really hope that you enjoy this little discussion that I had with Ian earlier today. So thank you so much for joining us and for lending your expertise.
Absolutely, I'm glad to be here.
I really appreciate it. Yeah, I'm sure the viewers will also appreciate it a lot. So I guess the first thing that we want to talk about is the specific characteristics of the countertenor. We're talking about, just sort of the general qualities, the vocal timbre and the weight. I know that we've kind of talked about this before, about there being really 3 countertenor types, and so I'm sure that they all have unique characteristics. So I don't know if you want to touch on that a little bit. That would be great.
Yeah, that's great. So the countertenor voice, it's problematic as a voice type designation. Imagine that there were just a single term that encompassed being a contralto and a mezzo-soprano and a soprano, or a single term that encompassed being a profound bass and a baritone and a tenor all at the same time. Countertenor is really, it's a catch-all term that in some ways is a way to set a certain use of the male singing voice apart from what we can be like normal male singing. So that's one of the problems. And I do split in my mind countertenors apart into sort of 3 groups based on both their tessitura, like their comfortable singing range, and also the way that they're able to navigate that range, like the way the color of the voice changes as they ascend and descend. But I think I should also point out, there's a big question, which is like, is Chris Colfer a countertenor? Was Michael Jackson a countertenor? Were the Bee Gees countertenors? Were the Beatles, when they sang backup, were they countertenors? And for me, this is what I've come to. I think you know, you would not ask the question as to whether a singer in a rock band is a soprano or a mezzo, because the rep itself does not necessarily ask you to make that sort of distinction. So for me, a countertenor, that's a voice type term that first and foremost is only really applied to somebody if they're studying to develop their technique in a way that is required to be able to sing unamplified in a large space with other unamplified instruments. So just to get it out of the way at the beginning, that's my personal bias about what it means to be a countertenor. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you know, have to study to sing Bach versus Mozart versus Handel, or, you know, have to study to sing modern music. You don't have to be able to do Oberon, or you don't have to be able to do the Refugee in Flight. Like there's a lot of space within that initial assumption that we're talking about singing unamplified in a large space with other unamplified instruments.
Well, can I interrupt you then?
Yeah.
So what about the male singer who is most comfortable singing from, let's say, C4 to E5? What if that is his tessitura, but he sings in contemporary styles? He's not trained classically, but that really is where his voice just naturally feels most comfortable, most energized. I mean, does that, just because he's not classically trained, does that then mean that he's somehow not a countertenor? I understand the whole, you know, I recorded a video on this before about, you know, is voice type relevant to commercial styles? And I'm of the belief that it is, because we do have to consider things like tessitura and vocal weight in considering our repertoire, even when we're not singing classical music.
Absolutely.
I think it's important. And so I guess that we take, you know, the singers like Chris, and we take the singers like Mitch from Pentatonics, and if we really listen to where they do so much of their singing, the bulk of their singing, and where they seem to be most comfortable, where they just gravitate toward, you know, that to me suggests a countertenor, even if they're not trained classically. And I don't know if we can really deny that. Like,
yeah, no, and that's, I mean, it's a great point. It's a fascinating thing to think through and talk about. So I guess my initial reply would be all men should be able to sing in what one would consider to be a countertenor pitch range anyway. I think that we tend to think of it as being this like special other thing, when in reality, I mean, honestly, I think a lot of it just comes down to like gender norms within Western society today. Like most men don't try to train that pitch range after their voice changes. And so then they lose facility, they lose the ability to get good chord closure in that pitch range. And then as a result, we have generations of men who, I can make a robust chest voice sound, but and it's a broken thing, right? And it sounds terrible up top, and we call it falsetto. And then we observe that, and we say, oh, most men can't do this. Therefore, there's something inherent about the male voice that inherently they cannot do that. And then we start describing what is as what could possibly be. And so, like, to me, that, like, that's the distinction, is somebody could sing in a countertenor pitch range. But, you know, until they're put in a situation where, you know, they're having to make registration choices in order to accomplish being able to fill a large space and compete with other unamplified instruments, there's just so much more wiggle room as to how they can technically achieve it. That to me, it doesn't rise to, it's not that there's not differentiation, but it doesn't rise to a voice type, you know, in the way that we find in older traditions, in classical traditions.
Okay, fair enough.
That's my take on it.
Fair enough. That's a good take. All right, so characteristics, if you want to divide them into, just really briefly talk about, the timbre, weight.
Yeah, sure. So I've found that there tend to be three divisions of what I would call countertenors that I think are working today as countertenors. And then there's a fourth, which we'd call a sopranist or a male soprano. Within like the countertenor category, I think of them as choral countertenor, Bach countertenor, and Handel countertenor. So obviously I'm displaying a little bit of my repertoire bias with these labels, but I think it describes the way most men's voices work. So the choral countertenor tends to be, you know, you'll find them a lot in English cathedral choir traditions. And, you know, they're technical challenges they tend to be able to sing fairly low into a chest voice that is maybe not necessarily, but can be seamlessly integrated into the bottom of what you might call their countertenor voice or their head voice. I know terms are tricky and slippery things. But a lot of those singers tend to top out at about the pitch D5. And this can be because, really their, if one were to say what's their normal voice or their non-countertenor singing voice, they tend to be baritones. And, a lot of what limits them to D5 maybe physiologically based, the rep doesn't tend to go up a lot higher than that anyway. So they're not necessarily challenged to sing higher than that. But then a lot of it is how they approach the registration from about A4 to about D5. There's a way to do that allows you, like with a female voice, that allows you to keep going higher. And there's a way to do that causes D5, E flat 5, E5 to be the top shelf. A Bach countertenor, has to have an E5 every night. And, also has to have lower pitches as well. Has to be able to sing A's, A flats below middle C. The Handel countertenor, there's kind of two different kinds. Some roles, like Tolomeo and Julius Caesar, for example, don't require a G5. A lot of the lead roles do, or at least require the ability to ornament up to a G5. So those are kind of the pitch range wise, those are the three main divisions that we tend to find in the rep. Is you top out at a D5, you have to be able to sing a great E5, or you top out at a G5 or have to be able to sing a great G5. Then we find in the male soprano, or most people call them sopranists voice type, if that's what it is. These are men, like their vocal folds are literally less massive than what we might consider to be a countertenor, might consider to be a male alto at least. And as a result of this, like all their limitations and the sort of characteristic turning points of the voice just all tend to be higher. So, these guys can sing B flat 5s and C5s and, C6s, and sometimes much, much higher. In terms of the color of the voice, I think a lot of the terms we might use to characterize the countertenor voice describe the way that some countertenors sound, rather than necessarily like an obligate quality of the voice. So, and tastes are really changing. If you even look over the past 40 years worth of countertenors, like what was considered to be a prized countertenor sound has really shifted. So if you look to, Deller and look to James Bowman, like that could be described as a very hooty sort of sound. Even if, especially in the case of Bowman, it was very sort of powerful and loud sound. It was still, whoa, like had a lot of that quality to it. The countertenor name that probably most of your viewers will be familiar with is David Daniels. And he was notable at the time, not because he was the only countertenor who ever really sang with like a beautiful, warm mezzo-soprano, is this a female voice that I'm listening to, ? Sort of quality. But he just, oh my God, he just did it so well. It's just like an exquisite instrument and really amazing musicality. But if you look at the guys who are doing well in the Met competition now, and the people who are like really singing opera as countertenors now, I feel like it's finally come to America, where we have a much more sort of hard edge and steely sound that you'll find in the countertenors. So I feel like it started maybe a decade ago with Franco Fagioli and Max Emanuel Chenchik. These guys were singing with very, very edgy qualities to their voices. And I guess the beautiful thing is, like, these are all obviously things that the male human voice is capable of doing. It's just, I think most of them are aesthetically driven, or in the case of singing like with an edgier, louder sound, that there's some economic incentive as well, because you can book into larger houses.
Well, there's some discussion even amongst tenors, where there's a belief that the tenors today have a lot of a beefier sound, beefier sound
Yeah.
than tenors of the past from 100, 150, even, hundreds of years ago. Obviously, we don't have the benefit of recordings to be able to compare them. But, many suspect that, they have a longer closed quotient, upwards of 70% most of the time, and you're hearing these much fuller sounds. And yes, exactly. Yeah. And so, I think that there are trends musically. I mean, we know this. We know vocally what even in contemporary singing, singers from the 30s, 50s, 90s even have different sounds than what we hear today. And what's prized and what's considered good quality, good singing, good timbre, what have you, it changes. It changes based on the culture and the expectations. And I think also with commercial styles, like what the music industry kind of pushes us to like and tells us what's good, and this is what you're supposed to think is good. This is what you're supposed to like. And I think now that we have the benefit of recordings in classical music as well, and there's just so much out there that now we have comparison, and now we have I think a lot more talk, a lot more awareness of the classical, the countertenor, and so now I think that those expectations, now people start sort of inserting certain expectations into the countertenor voice, and I think it's changing cultural expectations maybe.
And I think probably half the people listening to this are thinking this anyway, so I'll just go ahead and throw countertenors under the bus for them. Like, a lot of countertenors don't sound good. Like it's one will find, and especially if there are any voice teachers out there watching this, you will find if you get a countertenor into your studio that they will make a sound that you would not let a mezzo get away with. And like, you will probably have an initial reaction, which is something along the lines of, oh, that voice is probably supposed to sound like that, or, oh, that's just an inherent quality of the instrument. It petering out towards the bottom, it being too bright and brash, like A4, B flat 4, B4, C5.
I think thinness.
Yeah,
or a really thin voice, very hooty, thin voice, I think is what, even for myself, I mean, I would tend to associate with a countertenor, a poorly trained countertenor. But there are occasionally countertenors I hear, I'm like, oh, there's a nice fullness in the sound, not necessarily beefy, but it just sounds warm, it sounds balanced and rounded, it sounds healthy, it sounds skillful. But I think I think we associate that because I know you and I were talking earlier about, just the whole training approach when it comes to countertenors. And I think that it's sort of a mystery for a lot of singing teachers as to how to train the countertenor voice. Do we train them like females? Do we train them like their male counterparts? Like, how do we train those voices? And I think that leads us to maybe kind of not doing well by the countertenors that we train, because we don't know how to approach it. And that leaves them with those thin, hooty, or tinny kind of sounds,
or overly pressed, strained. Like, all of these qualities tend to be associated with the voice type. I had a colleague of mine, Josh Copeland. He said this, and it's just stuck in my head for like 15 years. He said that it has to be a voice, not a choice. When you listen to a countertenor, like, you can't be thinking like, oh, this guy really could have done something else with his life and choices. It just has to sound genuine, like a fully integrated instrument. It has to.
Yeah. So that leads us to some myth busting.
Let's do it.
All right. So I've read this in a number of different articles and books, and I think even Richard Miller says this as well, that there's this belief that countertenors are primarily falsettists. That is, they sing in falsetto. And my question for you is, do you think that this represents an ignorance about the actual physiology of the countertenor voice, or is it merely a matter of nomenclature? Because we know from earlier historic texts that oftentimes with the male singers, anything above speech inflection range, anything above chest voice was just called falsetto, whether it was head voice or what we now call falsetto. And so I wonder how much of that, those earlier writings really, when they spoke of the countertenor, wrote of the countertenor, was just, they were just using different nomenclature, like just, or how much of it is that just, we just don't know. We don't understand the countertenor voice very well.
I mean, those are amazing questions. I'll take a whack at it.
Sure.
I literally don't know what falsetto means. Like, I mean, I've read a lot of books and I teach classes, and I I think I tend to know what people mean when they say falsetto. Um, I personally, I like the way that Garcia used the younger uses the term, in which, if there's a chest voice and a head voice, he locates falsetto in between chest voice and head voice for both
Right.
women and men. For Garcia, falsetto was a way to describe, I think, a not particularly effectively coordinated glottis. I really think that's what it was. It's not that falsetto is it's not that it's a fixed register. It's one very unique, to my mind, very extreme positioning of the vocal folds in the flow of air.
I think medically speaking, when we talk about falsetto, it's usually described as there being, some sort of gap in the glottis, some sort of opening, whatever degree that might be, where you could hear even a poorly trained countertenor will still have a fair bit of glottal closure, but a tiny little gap at the back. And others, we hear in contemporary singers where they go into falsetto, it's that very airy or raspy kind of sound, and that's what I associate with falsetto. It's more of a quality, I think, than it is a register.
Yeah, well, I think it can be both. I mean, if you want to say that there's like a chest voice and a head voice, or a chest voice and a falsetto, or a modal and a loft, or a modal and a falsetto, like if you want to just recognize that the voice has this fundamental break in it, which you can either really draw attention to, or you can try to smooth over, right? But we're not born with uniform voices. I have a 3-year-old, I can attest to this. Like when she was crying, I would hear yodeling when she was a brand new infant. So yeah, no, it's just real. It's just how we're made.
Country singer in the making.
Yeah, exactly. For me, pedagogically speaking, thinking that there's a thing called a falsetto can be extremely useful, because it's important to make sure that you can have the folds vibrate with basically almost no weight and no medial compression. But the fact that you can go like you can come in and out of it,
Right.
means that it's a position along a continuum. And for me, the way that I think about registration, the term falsetto is not helpful, because the way that you get a countertenor from having a sort of option in their voice to something that is sort of rich and robust and has all of the spectral qualities that we like from chest voice. It has the brightness, it has the richness, has, in that countertenor pitch range anyway, it's really strong fundamental. I think the way that you get to that is by training the voice to do something that it's not adding ha to ha. It's not that, because ha is characterized by contracted thyroarytenoid muscles, which are providing a bulge of the vocal folds, which gets you your medial compression of the vocal folds. And you actually, with countertenors, you have to train other groups of muscles to cause the medial compression. And this is the same thing with women. Get any 17-year-old aspiring soprano into your studio, and when you start training the voice to do classical singing, it's going to sound great above C5. Thank you, Garcia, you were right. And as you go below C5, it's going to be airy. And then depending on how she's sort of worked out or not worked out her chest voice, maybe the chest voice will come in. But figuring out that middle voice, this is one of these things that, like, countertenor technique is not different from other genders' techniques. It's not different from female vocal technique. It's figuring out how to get that medial compression without a firm engagement of the thyroarytenoid in that middle voice area.
Without that pressing that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, without the pressing. And then there's, just to go on, there are specific things sort of inherent to the way that a male voice functions in that pitch range, unless we're talking about somebody who genetically or because of a hormonal disorder has sort of a abnormally small larynx or abnormally short or thin vocal folds. If we're talking about a male voice who could otherwise sing lower pitches in a healthy chest voice. So some people will, ask questions as to whether training a countertenor is different from training a female voice, and I think basically they're the same thing. There's a couple of ways in which I think the male voice, just its inherent physical structure, is going to be a little bit different from a female voice, and these all come into the pitch ranges where I like to say the voice fails well. So like we all have a part of the voice that works really well, and then a pitch range where it just works terribly. And in between those two there's always a range where it fails well, like it sounds good enough to keep going with it, but the technique would actually be improved if instead we took a step back and really balanced the voice out. And so like for a countertenor, for example, a female would not be able to stay necessarily in head voice. Like that's down to an E, and clearly it's terrible, but it failed very well at the A and very well at the G sharp. It was like iffy at the F sharp. A female voice like would probably not have that option to stay in what we might call a mode 2 or a non-thyroid engaged technique. A lot of countertenors will be able to do that, and so a countertenor might by default train down to the G3 in head voice. That same countertenor, if they never figure out how to do it with their TA muscle engaged, if they get hired to do, an oratorio gig, they might not be audible in the lower range. So there are little things like that. A countertenor may have to switch into, a headier or a whoopier. I don't know what terms people will recognize. They may have to switch their registration at a slightly lower pitch than a female would, okay. because their vocal tract might be bigger, because they're male.
That's what I was going to ask. If you're aware of any studies that have looked at the true countertenors and compared the size of the larynx and the vocal tract, length of the vocal tract and such, to, let's say, a lower voiced male, to a baritone or a bass or such. I just wonder if there's anything out there that we've actually sort of compared. Are they anatomically smaller? Do they have thinner vocal folds? And we're not talking about like the exceptions on the extremes, but just taking a look at your average countertenor, will say, is there a difference? I mean, so theoretically, if a male is able to phonate comfortably, and that's sort of his tessitura up higher in that, we'll say, let's say mezzo range, then theoretically there should be some similarity physiologically, and I could be entirely off base here, but in terms of the length of the vocal tract and the thickness of the vocal folds with, let's say, your average lyric mezzo-soprano.
Yeah.
I'm just guessing, but it just seems like there needs to be some study on this if there isn't already.
Yeah, so I mean, my resonances, my vocal tract resonances, my formants are where they should be for a baritone. Definitely, they're not where they should be for a mezzo. I think that there's, like I said at the beginning of our chat, there's a wide variety of types of voices that we would all lump into being a countertenor. So, I'm at this point in my life, I definitely am not a soprano countertenor. I would definitely be called an alto countertenor. So, it makes sense that my resonances are a little lower relative to where they could be. But I think it's important to understand that, one can have a good deal of facility in terms of the pitch range that you're able to sing in, regardless of what the resonances do. So the resonances dictate when certain registration transitions might take place. So for example, my first formant for an E is basically always at about this pitch. I think it's always right about an E4. So that means if I'm that I'm in whoop at that point. If your resonance, your first formant, your lowest resonance for an E, yours is probably a G4 or a G sharp 4, I would guess. If you sang that same E4 pitch, you would be singing below below the pitch of your resonance, below the frequency of your resonance.
Right.
For me, if I want to sing an eval higher than that resonance, I have to do an active adjustment. Versus where you can hear like the warmth falls out of the sound. You wouldn't have to do that active adjustment until a higher pitch. So like there are ways that it definitely impacts the color of the voice and our perception of like where the voice turns and changes. But it doesn't necessarily limit the pitch range you can sing in.
Right. Okay.
That,
As we discussed earlier, we were
no,
talking about registration earlier, and this idea that registration, to me, is not merely a physiological phenomenon. It's not just a matter of vibrational pattern of the vocal folds. It's not just a matter of muscle dominance. The resonance factors play a significant role in determining, what register we're in, which register we're in.
Yeah, and the two terms that are out there, in large part due to Donald Miller and Ken Bozeman and Scott McCoy, are whoop or hoot and yell. And I know yell comes across as a pejorative term, but if I just mean it as the alignment of the
First formant with the second harmonic.
The second harmonic, exactly.
Yeah.
So these are Ken Bozeman's hand signs.
Oh.
And one can be yelling and have it sound great. But I think it's important for us to recognize that like whoop and yell they're not just ways to sort of describe the sound of a voice after the fact. Like they're urges. Like if you get into a whoop resonance and start tracking it up, it feels good. And your mind body, like it wants to keep doing that sound. And you notice it when the vowels fall out of alignment because it stops feeling so powerful and strong. And the same thing for, an F1H2 coupling, for a yell coupling. Like there's a reason we do it. In classical singing, there's a reason that young baritone voices sort of get spread and then crack as we go up. Like it's not an arbitrary choice to raise the larynx and keep tracking that formant higher. Like it feels good. It feels powerful. So I think we have to think about the acoustics part of it as I think you're right. It's like it's co-equally important as think about glottal configuration, thinking about whatever register labels you might place on the arrangement of those muscles.
Well, that was, my next question was to talk about the acoustics, because I know that you have done some studying and some research and have written articles on this topic of acoustics, right, resonance. Yep. And I was just wondering, I know it changes. There's always that changing resonance relationship between the harmonics of the sung pitch and the formants of the vocal tract. And just wondering, is it a hoot or whoop resonance coupling that we're hearing that, first formant, second harmonic, the yell, or, what are we hearing in that sort of, I guess, a characteristic, I know it's different, but characteristic countertenor voice, what we tend to, we who maybe are not as trained in countertenors or as familiar with them, what we typically hear. What are we hearing acoustically speaking?
Yeah, it depends. It depends in part because there's again, there's so many different types of countertenors. So even if you took, this is a fun experiment actually, and everybody can go do this. If you take like Cara Sposa from Rinaldo, if that's a Handel aria, you can go find a recording on YouTube of David Daniels singing it, and you can find a recording of Philippe Jarouski singing it. He's a French countertenor.
Yes, he's kind of the big guy right now, isn't he? Yeah,
he's amazing. Jarouski's vocal tract resonances are higher than David Daniels's are. Just physiological. I don't think it's a technical choice that he made versus the way that David chose to train his voice. But if you go and critically listen, I mean, it's like Cara Sposa. That's the first line of that aria. If you go and listen, Jarouski's vowels are brighter. They're just objectively brighter than David's are. And it's not. I don't think it's because he's intentionally brightening. I think it's because by that pitch A4, David Daniels's voice has already gone through a turn, like an acoustic registration event, that Philippe Jaworski's has not.
Right.
So there's that. I mean, even again, within the countertenor club, there's like variations from person to person. So I think what matters most is understanding like where your specific countertenor student's voice needs to be making these turns. I think that's more important than trying to say generally all countertenors will do X. Because again, mezzos and sopranos, their voices change in different places.
Well, we also know from Donald Miller, who compared Domingo and Pavarotti on the same aria, and they show that they had two very distinct resonance strategies that they employed. And they were different, and they created obviously different qualities, but probably it's largely based on those, subtle differences from individual to individual based on things like where their informants naturally lie, and maybe on some training, some technical stuff as well. But we know that we all have different resonance strategies that we employ on certain pitches to achieve smoother registration for one, but also to achieve, different qualities, different colors and textures in our voices. And so I imagine it's the same thing here, that we can't just say it's like, Jaworski and Daniels, they have exactly the same strategies, same resonance couplings that we'll see. But if we were to study them, I'm not sure if somebody has or not. And it sounds like as though you know a little bit about that. So
yeah, I did a little studying them a couple of years ago.
Yeah, so you compare the two of them, and it's not just that they're using different resonance strategies per se because they're out of choice, but because out of necessity, maybe because of where their natural formants lie.
Yeah, and I think the way I think about voice training and registration solutions is that it's heuristic, which is it's this great word that just means there's like a good enough answer, but there isn't necessarily always an absolutely true answer or an exclusively true answer. And I think we have to expect variation. Yeah, and then it comes down to, well, what really are the qualities we care about? And I think a lot of that comes down to just ease, flexibility, ability to sing a reasonably wide range of pitches, and an ability to have a variety of dynamics and articulations. And so as long as the student can do that, I think the way that they navigate their own registration challenges is going to be a little bit like a fingerprint. It's going to be a little bit unique to that individual.
Right, good. So the last thing I know that we talked about was you have a register breaking exercise. I will definitely include the link to it in the description box below.
So this is an exercise that I actually credit a lot of the technique that I developed that allowed me to have a performing career. So this is an exercise called the flex, and this was taught to me by a woman named Lynn Vardaman, and it was taught to her by a man named Dan Merriman, and Dan Merriman studied with Cornelius Reed, and Cornelius Reed, as some of your listeners may or may not know, wrote pretty extensively in the second half of the 20th and just right into the 21st century about looking at historical voice treatises through what he would call a functional voice training lens. So, trying to ground everything that he said in some sort of historical document, but at the same time, bringing an awareness of how the voice actually functioned.
I'm a huge fan of Reed.
Yeah, Reed's great. Yeah. And especially if people can, I love his functional vocal training article. It's a 2-article series that he wrote in 67 or 68, I think. And then there's an article that he wrote, I want to say in 2008, it might be 2007, on cultivating functional listening skills. So if somebody is brand new to Cornelius Reed, I would suggest those first, and then go read Psyche and Soma and Bel Canto and sort of the books that he wrote.
The free voice for me was absolutely transformative. It changed how I looked at the singing voice. It changed my teaching. Yeah, it really did, because I started to really look at the functional. That became a really huge focus for me, and it just completely changed everything about everything that I do. So.
Yeah, I'm similarly converted. So the idea of register breaking is essentially to try and make a initially abrupt change between what we might call like idealized versions of voice registers. It gets all the way to, I forget which number Garcia exercise it is, but starting on D4, you're supposed to be able to go and like flip back and forth between
Right.
voices. So if we consider that to be like that's the roughest, most abrupt version of that idea, you can start using pitch, intensity, and vowel to really trick the vocal folds into giving you as much mass as you want.
Right.
So for example, going to a quiet oo to start off and crescendoing to another vowel. Like can allow you to sort of cut across that divide between the registers. So the idea with the register breaking exercise, though we're talking about the flex, is split it up into an octave or into a fifth. It just depends on what the student's able to do. And typically you'll start at a C#3, and you go chest voice, head voice, chest voice, sliding. And that's the nut of it. The C#3 is a lower head voice pitch than one would probably tend to use in their own registered voice, especially if you're a tenor or a baritone. I found for me as a countertenor, it was really helpful to kind of crack open that fifth below F4. Like the voice tends to work really well F4 and higher, and then for a countertenor, there's a fourth or a fifth below that's problematic. But just if I started a F sharp as an example, you'd start that would be the first thing that I would have the student do. Try to slide to have everything stay the same in terms of effort, in terms of laryngeal height. Use the vowel to help encourage the vocal folds to thin out as they lengthen. And then you'll add an at the top. And you notice that's not or like it's neither of those options. It's like this middle path where you get medial compression from other muscles than the thyroidoids. And then eventually you just do this through your whole range. And you end up training the voice to the point that instead of starts to be an option instead. And then it gets you into like a really kind of honky, nasty sound, but that ends up being the basis for what Michael Chance called a countertenor chest voice, which is just to say like there's a way to sing fully on and just below the staff, the treble staff, that is not thyroidnoid dominated.
So the first time that you were showing that change of vowel at the top, you went from the ah to the oo, ah. And then the times after that you demonstrated, it was just the ah all the way. Wait, does it change? Do you just start with the oo just to kind of find that, or?
I always think of exercises progressively. So so the easiest version is to pair quiet oo to get the head voice response or the longer, thinner vocal fold response.
And that that coordination develops, then they would move just to the ahs. Okay.
Yeah. And I think, if you're there, if you really are honest about what the vocal folds are doing in terms of their mass and their contact, if you open to an ah, it's not the ah that you want. Like those are the same vocal folds through an ah shape. So it's actually rebalancing the vocal folds. So you start with what's easy, and then you teach them that they can sort of open and rebalance the vocal folds from the oo to the ah, and then you take away the training wheels of the oo.
Oh, I like that training. That's good.
Yeah. I think
is there more to that exercise?
Yeah. So the ways that it gets more complicated is you start adding like 3-note patterns to the top of it, and then ah, 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 sort of wider ranging patterns to the top of it. But I think the idea is just, can the head voice, countertenor, chest voice, whatever you want to call it, can that basic phonatory setup be good first, so that you're not starting with ah, like, because if you're starting from that and you want to make a robust sound, you have to change something. Ah! If you can start from that, you don't have to change something to then move pitches and have it be robust.
Now, I know in a little chat that we had a number of weeks back, we were talking about the importance of developing chest voice and developing head voice and making sure that you have that, so you have that fuller, more robust sound. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think honestly, this is one of the things that people harp on Reed's writing about, is like, if the voice is already coordinated, it seems silly to break it back apart. Most voices are not coordinated. Most voices are in a state of imbalance and either need a more robust chest voice or need a more effective, well-closed head voice. I think it's not problematic to imagine a 17-year-old soprano who's been told that her high voice is beautiful for her entire life up to that point, and she'd be very afraid of ruining it by training the lower voice.
Right.
You find that a lot with countertenors too. I think much to their detriment, but partially it's because it's something that they have done well in their life and they've received praise for, and it's hard to get somebody to do something that sort of cuts across what they think makes them like beautiful to the world, really. I personally find it, and I think there's analogs to this, like any pedagogue you talk to, any methodology, like you fix the mix by being able to do chest voice well and head voice well. And, countertenor middle voice, just like female classical middle voice, it's essentially, it's mixing. It's taking qualities that you find present in the chest voice, which is to say, shallower spectral slope for the source sound. That's, it's just to say, like, louder, more present, higher harmonics to then be filtered by the vocal track. So like again, like, that's not a resonance tuning issue. That's, I'm not configuring my vocal folds well enough to send like a robust enough source signal through the vocal track. So when countertenors come to me, it's most frequent that they've, been able to sing very high, probably with some degree of pressing towards the top, and they go, ah, is how the bottom end of their voice is registered. And the solution with all of them is long, sustained chest voice notes with an intensity and a vowel that, gets the vocal folds working really, really well, gets a nice flow phonation, gets a rich source spectrum that then they can do something with, because then that can be a quality that they can try to imprint onto their countertenor voice.
Right. The two countertenors that I've worked with in my entire career, I haven't worked with a lot, both of them really struggled with chest voice. It was just not a comfortable place for them to be in. And we would explore that, we would develop that and work on it, but it was just not their happy place. And it wasn't even just, I don't think necessarily due to poor technique where it was feeling uncomfortable, it just, for whatever reason. And that was, just you're saying that, it's really important, even just the long sustained chest notes, and just to really continue like that. Like, oftentimes, like, classical sopranos are taught to bring that head voice down as low as they can go, and it really limits their lower range.
Yeah.
I've known many sopranos who carry down to about, the G3, so G below middle C, and that's as far as they can go, and they have no chest voice whatsoever because they've been trained in order to create some sort of homogeneous scale,
yeah,
and a consistent sound across, the entire piece. Throughout the entire piece, they have to somehow just stay in head voice. And I don't really buy into that personally, but there are a lot who are trained that way. And I suspect that with countertenors, it's also a similar situation where, well, if you're a countertenor, you must sing high. And that's where you should be singing, and your voice should be homogeneous, and it should be consistently produced, and therefore you must stay in the same register.
Yeah. Well, and I guess this is how I'd react to that. Training the low part of the voice, training, thick folds, training good vertical phase, short, fat vocal folds, and to be able to do that without pressing them. Training that, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be chesting the bottom part of your countertenor tessitura. It literally means the bottom part of your countertenor tessitura is going to be different by default. You're going to have control over muscles that you otherwise did not have control over, and you're going to be able to more subtly engage the thyroidnoid. It's not a light switch. It can gradually come in and gradually release. And so just like training that strength and that coordination, low, long chest tones, using messa da voce, with and without vowels that sort of aid the transition, like all of it doesn't mean that you're going to be, no, that the sun, like there isn't going to be like a line where you're like, oh, chest voice below and head voice above, but no, like being able to make that sound versus that it's the result of training the chest voice. and so like I don't see any other way. I just don't see any other way.
That's good. How's that for a 20-minute conversation?
We nailed it. Maybe it'll be a 3-part series.
I probably will have to divide this into 2 at least.
Yeah.
It was so good chatting with you, though.
You too, absolutely.
That was great. I really loved listening to you talk about this subject because it's fascinating, and there's seems to be a surge in countertenors these days, and a growing popularity of the countertenor voice, and I think it's something that we should be talking about more of, and from people who actually are familiar with the countertenor voice, who have performed as countertenors and who work with countertenors.
Can you believe that the Met Opera did not do a Handel opera until 1980?
Really?
That was the first time that a Handel opera was done, was in 1980.
Wow.
I think you're right. Like it's we see them in conservatories now. We have undergraduates coming as countertenors now. Which never would have happened 40 years ago. Like it would have been the secret shame that you'd go and figure out on your own.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting. I think because, again, culturally speaking, there's always been that men should have low voices, and if they don't, then there is this sort of, either that or it becomes this sort of, I hate to say this, but like freak show kind of thing. Ooh, he can sing high, and you're all excited about that. But, there's this disconnect between that, that high voice and this concept that it can be artistic and beautiful and skillful. There's just no, that's sort of a party trick. And then
and sound genuine, like sound like it should be attached to that body.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think now that I think we're understanding more about the countertenor voice, and now we're understanding a little bit more about how to train it, now we're starting to hear these much more artistic and beautiful voices. And I think that's only going to do really great things for advancing the knowledge about tenors and really just opening up places for them in the opera houses.
Yeah. Well, and I hope too it means that I think there's pedagogical value in training like the falsetto as though it can have fullness for tenors and baritones. Like
I did that with my students.
Yeah, you have to.
I don't have a single, like even baritone who can't sing comfortably up to an F5, for example.
Yeah.
It's not the fullest sound per se. It's not where they're going to be doing a lot of their singing, but they can sing up there comfortably and with some decent coordination, and we're continuing to develop that. But you're right. I don't see any reason why any male of any voice type can't develop that part of the range and be able to sing there safely and comfortably with ease, and even artistically effectively somewhat. I mean, it's not their tessitura. It's not where I think ultimately they should be singing all the time. I don't think that's necessarily healthy for them, but you know?
And for me, it comes back. I forget which postulate of vocology this is, but you know, there's this idea that you want to always be in an equilibrium position. And you know, just for example, like I'm not going to sing a C6, but if one thinks that the tongue position for the E vowel is the forward range of like limit of the forward range of motion of the tongue, then you know it's like we're leaving out this other part of how the muscle itself can move. And high notes are just muscles. You know, it's just a stretch. And so if you never do that full stretch, then you're setting your equilibrium position much lower within your tessitura, you know, than is actually, I think, useful. So